It was a humid July evening when a small Ukrainian strike team positioned itself near Pokrovsk. Their mission was clear, but the stakes were almost impossible. Deep behind Russian lines, hidden beneath layers of fortifications and defenses, stood one of Moscow's most valuable lifelines, a sprawling ammunition depot near Kharkiv. For weeks, that depot had kept the Russian artillery roaring across Donetsk, pounding Ukrainian positions with endless barrages. Destroying it would mean more than a tactical victory. It would silence guns, stall offensives, and send a message that even Russia's most protected stockpiles were no longer safe. But to get there, the team wasn't relying on brute force. Instead, they carried something far more precise, far more advanced: the Vilkha-M missile system. Unlike the Soviet-era rockets that once blanketed entire fields, the Vilkha-M wasn't built to saturate ground with fire. It was built to cut deep, strike exact coordinates, and turn fortified targets into rubble with surgical precision. Every operator in that convoy knew the importance of what they were about to attempt. If the missiles reached their target, thousands of tons of Russian munitions would vanish in a single flash. But if they failed, the Russians would not just survive. They would retaliate with overwhelming force. The team set up in silence, calibrating their launchers under a sky that offered no hint of the chaos about to unfold. Every coordinate entered, every adjustment made, brought them closer to a decision that could shift the course of battles raging across the east. The mission wasn't just about destroying a warehouse. It was about proving that Ukraine's ingenuity could pierce through Russia's most formidable shield. And yet, as their systems hummed to life, a darker reality loomed. Russian radars were everywhere, scanning, waiting, listening. The Ukrainians were moving in shadows, but the slightest electronic signature could betray them. And when that happened, the countdown to survival would begin. Barely minutes after the first systems powered up, the silence was broken. Not by sound, but by an invisible signal. High above the tree line, the Zoopark-1M counter-battery radar came alive. Its sweeping pulses caught the faint electromagnetic emissions from the Ukrainian launchers. In that instant, the hunters became the hunted. To the Ukrainians on the ground, nothing seemed different. But on the Russian side, alarms flashed red. Within seconds, coordinates were calculated, trajectories plotted, and firing solutions transmitted. The order was swift: unleash a barrage. The weapon chosen was not subtle. Dozens of BM-30 Smerch rockets, each the size of a telephone pole and capable of erasing entire city blocks, were programmed to rain down on the Ukrainian position. And with the Zoopark feeding them precise data, the strike was not a matter of if, but when. From the moment the radar locked on, the clock began ticking. 6 minutes. That's all the Ukrainian crew had. 6 minutes to program their missiles, launch the strike, and vanish before Russian steel and fire swallowed their location whole. Inside the Vilkha-M cabin, the atmosphere shifted. What was supposed to be a calculated operation had turned into a race against death itself. Each keystroke on the targeting system carried the weight of survival. Outside, the night air felt heavier, as though every shadow warned of the rockets already inbound. There was no going back now. Either they fired within those 6 minutes, or they wouldn't live to see the 7th. On one side of the battlefield stood Russia's Smerch multiple rocket launcher, a weapon designed for sheer devastation. Mounted on massive trucks, it could unleash 12 300mm rockets in less than a minute. Each rocket carried a warhead capable of ripping open football fields of land, whether through fragmentation, incendiaries, or even cluster munitions. To be caught in its blast radius was to vanish under a storm of steel. It wasn't precision, it was obliteration. the kind of weapon that erased maps instead of marking coordinates. Facing it was something altogether different. Ukraine's Vilkha-M, though born from an old Soviet design, had been reshaped into a modern precision instrument. Sleek, calculated, and far lighter in numbers. Where the Smerch relied on overwhelming firepower, the Vilkha-M relied on sophistication. Each missile carried a triple-layered navigation system, GPS, Russia's own GLONASS satellites, and a built-in inertial unit that functioned even if the skies were jammed. If one signal failed, another took over. That redundancy gave it something rare on modern battlefields, almost guaranteed accuracy. The contrast was brutal. Russia brought a hammer. Ukraine brought a scalpel. And on this night, both were about to be tested in real time. For Moscow, letting those precision rockets fly meant gambling with an ammunition depot packed with thousands of tons of munitions. For Kiev, failing to launch meant their team would be buried under a storm of incoming fire. The duel wasn't just between armies, it was between two philosophies of war: saturation versus precision, quantity versus quality. And as the seconds drained from their 6-minute window, the Ukrainian crew had no choice but to prove which approach would rule the night. Inside the cabin of the Vilkha-M, the pressure was unbearable. What should have been a calm, step-by-step procedure was now a desperate sprint. Normally, programming a missile took 3 minutes. Tonight, the crew knew they had barely half of that. Every second lost meant the Smerch rockets were one step closer to impact. The operator's fingers moved across the console with machine-like speed, entering coordinates, double-checking targeting data, shaving seconds wherever they could. Outside, the night was eerily quiet, broken only by the faint hum of electronics and the tension in every breath. Then, the Russians made their move. Jamming signals surged across the spectrum, cutting into GPS feeds and disrupting external guidance. Screens flickered, alarms flashed. The enemy wasn't just watching anymore, they were blinding the missiles before they were even launched. The crew had no choice but to switch to manual input and preloaded data. It was riskier, less precise, but time for perfection had already run out. The choice was simple: fire now or die in silence. The order came, and with it, the first missile roared skyward. The launch lit up the field in blinding white, announcing their position to every radar within range. In seconds, they were no longer a hidden strike team. They were a glowing target. One missile wasn't enough. They compressed the firing sequence, cutting the safety gap from 45 seconds to 30. The second rocket screamed into the night. Then the third. Then the fourth. Each launch bought them a chance at success, but also made their position more obvious, more vulnerable. And then came the sound no one wanted to hear: the distant thunder of incoming rockets. At first a faint echo, then louder, sharper, until the ground itself seemed to vibrate. The Smerch barrage was already in, but one missile dodging death wasn't the end of the story. Moments later, the other 3 Ukrainian rockets entered the zone, each launched from slightly different angles. Russian radars scrambled, trying to track multiple fast-moving targets that refused to fly straight. The Tor systems shifted their aim. The Panzer S-1s, combining cannons and missiles, opened fire in rapid bursts. Even the aging Shilkas came alive, filling the night with tracers. What should have been a coordinated, precise defense dissolved into chaos. Explosions dotted the sky as interceptors detonated, but most of them struck only empty air. The Ukrainian missiles twisted, rolled, recalculated their paths, and pressed forward. For the first time, Russia's so-called impenetrable shield was starting to crack. The duel was no longer radar against rocket. It was man versus machine, quantity versus intelligence. And in the confusion, Ukraine's precision weapons were winning the race. What had begun as a flawless Russian defense plan was unraveling by the second. The sky over Kharkiv looked like a storm of fire, trails of interceptors climbing upward, bursts of explosions flashing mid-air, and tracer rounds streaking in every direction. Yet for all the noise and light, the Ukrainian missiles refused to die. The secret wasn't just the Vilkha's evasive programming. It was the way they were launched. Instead of firing in a predictable sequence, the Ukrainians had staggered their missiles at different intervals and angles. One came low, another high. A third swung wide before correcting its path. Each forced the Russian radars to split their attention, tracking targets that simply wouldn't behave like the textbooks predicted. Operators inside the Russian batteries were overwhelmed. The Tor crews were trying to reload. The Panzer radars were jumping between multiple blips, launching interceptors into the night without knowing which target was real. Even the Shilkas, relics from another era, sprayed the darkness with desperate fire. But the cracks were showing. For every second wasted in confusion, the Ukrainian projectiles closed the distance. Their trajectories bent, twisted, recalculated, slipping through the very gaps that shouldn't have existed. The so-called steel belt around the depot was starting to look like a net full of holes. From above, Ukrainian drones captured the scene in eerie detail. The Russian sky, once thought to be impenetrable, was now a chaotic patchwork of explosions chasing ghosts. And through that chaos, the bright arcs of the Vilkha rockets kept cutting forward, closer and closer to Kharkiv. What Russia had built to be an unbreakable wall was crumbling under pressure. And at its core, the lesson was undeniable. Brute force can only overwhelm until precision finds the cracks. The depot was now within reach. Then, the moment everyone had been waiting for arrived. The first missile pierced the final layer of defenses and struck the outer perimeter of the depot, a brief silence giving way to a massive explosion that lit up the night. A chain reaction followed, stockpiled munitions igniting one after another in a rolling wave of fire and thunder, while other missiles struck deeper inside, tearing through bunkers with columns of flame that climbed toward the sky. The fourth strike hit the heart of the underground storage, packed with thousands of tons of ammunition, and the resulting blast shook the earth itself, reducing the fortified facility to a blazing crater that illuminated the horizon in a terrifying orange glow, visible even from space. In just minutes, over 3,000 tons of munitions, enough to fuel weeks of Russian artillery fire, were gone, effectively silencing their guns in the sector. But the impact wasn't only material. Psychologically, the blow was devastating. Russian soldiers who had believed their depots were untouchable now realized that nowhere was truly safe. Supply lines scrambled, artillery fell silent, and the illusion of invincibility vanished. For Ukraine, this wasn't just a successful mission. It was proof that precision, technology, and courage could overcome brute force. The small strike team had not only survived, they had delivered a message written in fire across the Donetsk sky. No place is safe, and the war can be changed with brains, timing, and bold action.